all of the adverse events, with the excess deaths, with the information coming out about clinical trials, with the Pfizer profits, with Moderna pushing, 4,000% markup on prices. You're starting to think that people have changed their opinion.
Now, I mean, we would expect vested interests from the pharmaceutical industry. They are there absolutely at the end of the day to make money. That's what you would expect. But we're talking here about our regulatory authorities. Now, we used to trust these regulatory authorities. We thought they had our best interests at heart. But it appears that they have these conflicts of interest that just are, to my mind, is not acceptable. So if you're in an argument with a doctor, what you'll often say is, well, have you got a randomised double-blind controlled trial evidence of that? Well, actually, a lot of the time, I'm afraid we don't. Because randomised double-blind controlled trials are conducted essentially entirely by the pharmaceutical industry. They cost probably upwards of $10 million each. So who's going to bother doing a randomised double-blind controlled trial on vitamin D or ivermectin or other repurposed drugs that are probably very, very efficacious for various conditions, because they're not under patents anymore. You can't make any money. So Santoshi Omura's institution in Japan, he discovered ivermectin. His institution in Japan offered Merck their facilities to run a randomised double-blind controlled trial at the start of the pandemic on ivermectin. And of course Merck didn't want to, because there was no... Well, I can't say why Merck didn't want to, but Merck didn't want to.
But I might posit that is because it's not a profitable medicine. And the hysteria that surrounded that conversation was, I think, one of the moments where we came to recognise what was happening in that pandemic. That there was a form of media totalitarianism and the assertion of establishment control that, if it was taking places under the guises of another ideology, would be called out for what it was: hysteria. I was thinking that the way that you just described that double-blind trial process as being an expensive, costly one, and therefore necessarily under the auspices of a profit-driven model, only undertaken in pursuit of profits. That's no one's questioning, and in a sense, that's what is at the heart of this: power, dominion, finance, and we're seeing this modality mapped onto reporting, and those revelations around Fauci's emails, the fact that there were three theories at the beginning, and then all of a sudden they just stopped talking about two of them, and the fact that Wuhan does have ties to the EcoHealth Alliance. All of this accumulative information, what does it suggest to us about the driving force behind policy?
Yeah, there's no question that there's been a particular narrative that the pharmaceutical industry can do some trials and choose not to do other trials.
Yeah.
So the data that we get out from this is only what they've decided to put into the system in the first place. But what's been really disappointing in the pandemic is how quickly any protection has waned. Now, the idea that you have the vaccine and the infection stops with you, that was always nonsense.
That was always nonsense.
Yeah, nothing is 100% effective in medicine. The only thing that's sure in life is death and taxes, isn't it? It was never 100%. But as time going on, it's become patently clear that is not the case. So now, if you are vaccinated, you probably are going to spread the disease a little less for a short period of time, but only for a very short period of time, probably only about 10 or 15%. It's essentially a negligible effect. So this emotional blackmail that you should have your shot to protect your granny, really, why did people say that when it was patently untrue? After the first few months, we knew that wasn't true, and that's another problem with the pandemic. As time has gone on, the data that was collected is no longer being collected. So how many people are dying? Were they vaccinated or not? So that was published every 2 months, sometimes every 6 weeks, up until the 31st of May 2022. They stopped publishing it then. Now, the data before then was showing that the vaccine effect was waning quite dramatically. But for 8 months now, having published it religiously every 2 months, but for 8 months now we've had no data at all. So we don't know who is dying in the UK by vaccination status. They stopped publishing that data. Now, why did they stop publishing that data? We don't know. It does seem a bit strange that they were meticulous about it every 2 months. We know that the ONS is still being funded by the government to the tune of several £1 million a month, but they're not producing that data. We need to know deaths by vaccination status, because we know the efficacy of the vaccine wanes with time. We know that it's not really preventing transmission in any serious way. We know that the vaccine protection against severe illness, hospitalisation and death wanes with time. But at the same time, we know that because there's such a high prevalence of COVID in the community, that you and I are constantly being reinfected. We know that's boosting our mucosal immunity, and we're getting this constant top-up. So we're still getting this narrative where the natural immunity is being ignored. The vaccine benefits are being talked up dramatically, but how many people are dying by their vaccination status? It's been ignored for the last 8 months. We simply don't know what it is. Why has that not been published? Is a very interesting question.
Look, sometimes we lose heart, I think, because there's so much cynicism and so much suspicion and sometimes anger towards the institutions. But actually institutions, whilst there is a sort of a systemic, almost algorithmic consciousness that takes place within these institutions, they are ultimately human beings as well. And if there are human beings that are corrupted, then that situation can be uncorrupted, but we can reassess the type of institutions and the type of individuals we endow with power. If we can envisage for a moment an Anthony Fauci that was as devoted to data and research as you are, then the public response to the pandemic in the United States would have been in keeping with the narrative that you've described. Oh, it seems like a sensible thing to do initially. Hold on, we've got more data. We need to address this. Hey, let's look at these adverse events. But that's simply not what happened, because the truth was too bloody inconvenient to be addressed, and so many factors came together. So thank you for that, Doctor. Thanks for your diligence and your duty.